There was a time when I worked as a Coast Guard officer in Barrow, the northernmost city of the United States, located above the Arctic Circle in northern Alaska. The city had a population of about 4,500 people living in the extreme Arctic climate where periods of polar day and polar night determined the rhythm of life. My mornings began quite early, either in the darkness of polar night or under the bright sun of polar day, depending on the season. I started each day with a cup of hot coffee, which not only warmed me up but also helped me fully wake up. Then I would change into warm gear, checking every detail of my equipment because in these conditions, every detail could be critically important. Leaving home, I always encountered the sharp cold air, reminding me of the severity and beauty of this remote corner of the world. Barrow presented a majestic sight, where endless ice met the dark waters of the Arctic Ocean, and the sky was adorned with breathtaking auroras. My journey to work was short, but every morning I remained vigilant because of the possibility of encountering polar bears, which sometimes wandered into the city. Work began with a morning briefing, where we discussed tasks for the day, including patrolling the sea and coastline, training, and any emergency situations requiring our intervention. My work in the Coast Guard encompassed a wide range of activities, from conducting rescue operations to monitoring compliance with environmental regulations and safety rules on the water. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to reaffirm the importance and significance of our work in ensuring safety and maintaining order in this unique Arctic environment. One time, on an early winter morning, Captain Jonathan Hales summoned me. As soon as I entered, he got straight to the point, his voice tense but confident. "We're facing an emergency situation," he began, his gaze fixed on me. The research station Arctic Frontier, located 100 miles east of Barrow, sent out an SOS signal. They're not responding to calls after the signal was sent, and we have no information about what's happening there. It could be anything from a technical malfunction to a situation requiring medical evacuation. The captain stood up from his desk and approached the maps on the wall. "Your task is to assemble a team and immediately head to the Arctic frontier. We need to establish communication with the base as soon as possible, assess the situation, and provide necessary assistance." I nodded, realizing the seriousness of the moment. "Understood, Captain. How much time do we have?" "Every minute counts," he replied firmly. "I want you and your team airborne within the hour. Make sure you have everything you need for the search and rescue operation and for providing first aid. I've already ordered the helicopter to be prepared and equipped with all necessary gear. And according to meteorologists, a storm is approaching, so you need to find out what's happening there and return as quickly as possible." After a brief discussion of the mission details, I left Captain Hale's office and headed to my team. Entering our quarters, I found myself in a spacious room where the severity of the Arctic climate contrasted with the warmth and coziness inside. The walls were adorned with photographs of past missions and maps of the area, and a fireplace burned in the corner, creating an additional sense of comfort. In the center stood a large table with maps and navigation equipment spread out, and around the perimeter were personal lockers with gear for each team member. My team was already gathered around the table. They were true professionals, each with their unique set of skills. Mike, our navigator, always calm and focused, studied the map of the area. Alex, our communication specialist, checked the radios and satellite equipment. Rob, the medic, meticulously arranged the first aid kit, double-checking the presence of all necessary medications. Jack, the most experienced in the team and our mechanic, inspected the technical gear. Approaching them, I quickly relayed Captain Jonathan Hale's words about the situation at the Arctic Frontier Research Station and the need for immediate expedition preparation. Without further ado, we began preparing. I ensured each of us was properly equipped for Arctic conditions. warm clothing, specialized suits for working in extremely cold water, communication, and navigation devices. We made sure all necessary equipment was packed, from food supplies to technical gear for rescue operations. After completing our expedition preparations, we headed to the helipad where the helicopter awaited us. It was a Sikorsky S-92, a reliable and powerful machine specially designed for tasks in the harshest conditions, including the Arctic climate. The S-92 was known for its outstanding performance in extreme weather conditions, ability to carry a large number of passengers and cargo, as well as a high level of safety. Its spacious cabin was equipped with everything we needed for our mission, including medical equipment, communication, and navigation aids. Mike, our pilot, did a final check of the helicopter's systems, ensuring everything was ready for takeoff. He professionally inspected the engines, control systems, and navigation, confirming that the S-92 was in perfect condition for the upcoming flight. One by one, we, his team, boarded the helicopter, each taking our place and securing ourselves. Alex and Daniel settled near the equipment needed for first aid and rescue operations, while Chris stationed himself at the radio, ready to establish communication with the base and coordinate our actions with Captain Hales at any moment. I sat next to Mike, ready to provide any support in helicopter operation. Once everyone was on board and ready for takeoff, Mike started the engines. Rising into the air, our helicopter effortlessly and confidently headed towards the destination. The capability of this helicopter model to cover 100 miles there and back in the conditions of the Arctic North made it an ideal choice for our mission. The powerful engines provided stable and safe flight even in strong winds and low temperatures, while special heating systems protected us and our equipment from freezing. Below us stretched endless ice fields and snowy plains, glistening under the rare rays of the Arctic sun. The boundary between the sky and the earth seemed blurred, creating a sensation of flying in an infinite white space. The flight was surprisingly smooth, despite the strong Arctic winds that sometimes crossed our path. In the distance, the contours of mountain ranges began to emerge, their peaks covered in snow and ice, protruding from the snowy blanket, creating a majestic and simultaneously impregnable picture. Ice floes drifting in the Arctic Ocean resembled huge white ships sailing through the dark, cold waters. After an hour of flying over the frozen emptiness of the Arctic, our helicopter approached the destination. Below, amidst the boundless white landscape, the Arctic Frontier Research Base came into view. It resembled an oasis amidst the eternal ice, a small island of life in the ocean of frost and snow. The base consisted of several modular buildings, painted in bright colors to contrast with the surrounding snowy desert, which also helped to distinguish them amidst the endless white sea. Around it spread a snowy landscape, intersected only occasionally by tracks of vehicles and equipment. Approaching the base, we felt a mix of excitement and tension. No one greeted us, which seemed strange for a place that had just signaled distress. The helicopter gently touched down on a small landing pad, cleared of snow near the main buildings. Quickly assessing the situation and ensuring the safety of the landing, Mike shut down the engines, and the Arctic silence engulfed us with all its weight. It was a deep, almost palpable silence, rarely disturbed here, at the edge of the world. We stepped out of the helicopter, plunging into the harsh Arctic atmosphere. The cold air hit our faces, but we were prepared for it, dressed in special protective clothing. Looking around, we saw no one. All the buildings seemed empty, despite the doors and windows being tightly shut. There were no signs of life except for the howling wind, carrying snow whirls across the snowy expanses around the base. As we approached the main building of the Arctic Frontier Base, we noticed that the door was ajar, despite the strict safety rules usually observed in such conditions. This already raised alarming thoughts. I cautiously pushed the door, and it silently swung open before us, inviting us inside. "Hello! Is anyone here?" My voice echoed down the corridor, but there was only silence in response, broken only by the creak of our footsteps on the floor. Inside, chaos reigned. Papers and personal belongings were scattered everywhere, as if there had been a struggle or people were in a hurry to leave the place. The air was filled with a sense of unease, which grew with each step deeper into the base. We split up to inspect different modules. I headed to the scientific section, where tables were cluttered with equipment and notes. Computers and monitors were overturned or broken, and on one of the tables lay an overturned microscope with slides scattered around it. It resembled a scene from a horror movie, where scientists encounter something unknown and dangerous. For a moment I thought I heard a rustle behind me, but turning around, I found nothing but emptiness. Alex explored the residential module, where he found overturned furniture and broken dishes. Beds were hastily made, and blankets lay on the floor as if their owners had jumped up in a hurry and rushed away. The air was filled with the smell of fear and desperation. Daniel peeked into the medical block, where he found open first aid kits and scattered medical supplies. Unfinished medical records lay on one of the tables, as if the doctor had left them in a hurry. Chris, checking the communication module, found broken radios and torn cables. It was evident that someone or something had tried to hinder any possibility of communication with the outside world. Meeting in the central part of the base, we exchanged information and concluded that something terrible had happened here. The base seemed completely abandoned, and the question of where all its inhabitants had disappeared hung in the air, adding gloominess to the already unpleasant atmosphere. While we discussed our initial impressions of what we saw inside the base, Mike returned from one of the rooms, holding a laptop. "You should take a look at this," he said with a serious expression. He carefully placed the laptop on the table in the center of the room, where we could all see it, and played a video found in its memory. On the video, which Mike played, a man in laboratory attire appeared, his gaze fixed directly on the camera. He began speaking in a calm but confident voice. "Hello, my name is Professor Jameson. This is our first day at the Arctic Frontier Base. I would like to briefly tell you about our mission here and the team working with me." The professor continued. "Our main goal is to research the Arctic regions in search of valuable minerals. We will also be conducting drilling to collect rock samples, which will help us better understand the geological structure of this part of the Arctic. In addition to this, our team is studying the impact of the Arctic climate on various processes related to resource extraction." He smiled, adding, "So far, everything is going well. We are actively taking measurements and preparing equipment. The team is optimistic, and we are determined to achieve significant results in our research." Professor Jameson then briefly introduced members of his team, who stood beside him and smiled at the camera. "Each of us has our own specialization, but together we form a strong team ready to face any challenges that this harsh Arctic environment may present." The recording continued for several more minutes, with the professor sharing his hopes and expectations for the upcoming work, emphasizing the importance of safety and mutual support in such extreme conditions. Suddenly, the image on the laptop screen changed, and now Professor Jameson looked somewhat concerned. He began to speak about how several days had passed since their arrival at the Arctic Frontier Base. "Tomorrow, we are supposed to start drilling," he said, his voice sounding more tense than before. "But there's something that worries me. Some members of our team have been complaining about hearing strange noises at night. They describe them as howls or moans coming from afar." The professor paused, sighed, and continued. It seriously disrupts normal sleep and is beginning to affect their health. People are becoming irritable. Some are showing signs of insomnia. We've tried to find the source of these sounds, but so far without success. On the video, he could be seen turning to exchange glances with other team members, who nodded in agreement with his words. We don't know if these sounds are related to our activities here, or if it's something natural to this area. But we must remain vigilant. The safety of the team is my top priority, and I won't allow anything to threaten it. The image on the screen changed again. This time the video was from a body camera worn by one of the expedition members. As I understood, the professor was off camera. The screen showed breathtaking Arctic expanses, endless snowy fields stretching to the horizon. The team was busy setting up drilling equipment. The voice behind the camera commented, "Here comes the big day. We're starting the first drilling." The video continued, and we saw the drill biting into the icy surface, drilling a hole. Everything was going smoothly until suddenly mysterious sounds began emanating from the drill. On the screen, everyone around started looking around, trying to understand the cause of these strange noises. The voice behind the camera expressed surprise and some concern. Suddenly, something akin to an explosion occurred. An invisible wave knocked everyone around. The person with the camera fell but quickly got up, turning to make sure the team was okay. It seemed that no one suffered serious injuries or trauma, but everyone was clearly frightened by what had happened. Then they started pulling the drill out of the newly drilled hole. The camera peeked inside the hole, but nothing was visible, just deep darkness. From this darkness, a strange howl suddenly emanated, causing everyone to freeze. The faces of the people reflected confusion and fear as they exchanged glances, trying to understand what exactly was making these sounds. The atmosphere in the video was tense. All team members seemed deeply disturbed and frightened by this inexplicable phenomenon. The camera slowly moved to one of the team members who suddenly froze, pointing at something on the drill. "Look, there's something here," he barely murmured. The camera zoomed in, and on the screen appeared a small, spongy lump. Curious, the man reached out and touched it. At that moment, something unbelievable happened. The lump suddenly wriggled, and with incredible speed jumped onto his hand, then like a living creature crawled up his arm and jumped straight into his mouth. The man choked with horror, desperately trying to get rid of the creature, but it was futile. His desperate attempts to spit it out were unsuccessful. Panic ensued. Suddenly, his body began convulsing, and he fell to his knees. What happened next was so horrifying that to every witness of this scene, it felt as if they were in the midst of a nightmare. Under the influence of some unknown force, the man began to shed his clothes in a frenzy. His hands elongated before their eyes, and his skin started to be covered in thick fur. His head deformed, taking on the shape of a wolf's muzzle, and a row of razor-sharp teeth emerged from his mouth. He raised his head to the sky and let out a blood-curdling howl that echoed through the Arctic expanse. At first we stood in shock, not believing our eyes, and then instinctively huddled together, not knowing what to do next. Suddenly, the creature grabbed its head, emitting sounds resembling groans of pain, and moments later, like a ghost, disappeared into the cold Arctic emptiness. After the horrifying incident where something unidentified attacked one of the team members, turning him into a creature from the darkest nightmares, everyone stood there, engulfed in shock and disbelief. No one could fully understand or explain what had just happened right before their eyes. An atmosphere of tension and fear enveloped the group, causing each member to question their safety and what else this frozen desert might hold. The voice off camera, presumably belonging to Professor Jameson, called for everyone to immediately return to the base. His voice sounded restrained, but an underlying sense of concern was palpable. The camera showed the team, still under the impression of what they had witnessed, slowly backing away from the scene, glancing around as if expecting something to ambush them at any moment. Then the footage shifted to an image of a hand in a protective glove, delicately using tweezers to pick up a piece of spongy substance from the drill. The very thing that had caused such horrific consequences. The substance was carefully placed into a vial with special attention and caution to avoid any contact with the skin. The vial was securely sealed and labeled for further analysis. The scene changed again, and on the screen appeared Professor Jameson, sitting in some room at the Arctic Frontier Base. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by evident concern. He looked directly into the camera, sighing deeply before speaking. When we returned to the base after the drilling incident, we found that our communication had been completely cut off. We could no longer call for help. His voice sounded troubled, and he periodically glanced around as if expecting something to interrupt him at any moment. Coincidentally, the man who transformed was our radio operator, the professor continued, pausing as if trying to choose the right words to describe the unbelievable transformation. We suspect that the wave, accompanied by strange sounds and the sudden explosion, may have damaged our equipment. Perhaps it had some electromagnetic origin that disabled our communication devices. The professor paused again, his gaze becoming more serious. We're trying to restore communication on our own, but honestly, we're not sure when that will be possible, he said, looking tired, as if the weight of these events was heavily upon him. Everything that has happened has seriously undermined the morale of our team. We're demoralized, stunned, and isolated here, in this frozen desert, with no means of calling for help. The scene changed again, and we saw Professor Jameson sitting in the same room. Visible dark circles under his eyes and a troubled expression on his face indicated that the past few days at the Arctic Frontier Base had been a real trial for him and his team. He began to speak in a quiet but tense voice. It's been 8 days at the station. Yesterday, something unbelievable happened. His voice trembled, and he occasionally paused, sighing deeply. A blizzard started around the station. We were sitting in the main hall, trying to distract ourselves, playing board games, when suddenly someone knocked on the door. The professor paused, as if he himself couldn't believe what was happening. Imagine, in the middle of the Arctic, someone is knocking on our door. We sat there, frozen in shock, not knowing what to do. Then he continued. So I got up and approached the door. We have a reinforced window in the middle of the door, so peeking through it, I saw our radio operator, Nicholas. He was standing in the middle of the blizzard wearing just pants, looking at me as if nothing had happened, asking to be let in. The professor paused for a moment as if gathering his thoughts. My colleagues came up and also saw it. We stood there not knowing what to do. Someone said we should let him in, but someone objected, saying it might not be him anymore, but some kind of monster. His voice conveyed agonizing uncertainty and fear of making a decision. We decided to vote, and the majority decided not to open the door. The professor's voice sounded even more exhausted. He kept standing outside in the blizzard. We couldn't bear it and covered the window with fabric. The scene changes again, and on the screen appears Professor Jameson, sitting in a room shrouded in a gloomy atmosphere. His expression is disheartened, and he looks even more exhausted than before. The situation is getting worse, he begins, looking directly into the camera, his voice sounding tired and hopeless. Along with the strange noises outside, there's also knocking on the door. Nicholas, or whoever he is, won't leave us alone. He keeps banging on the door, shouting. Usually, he asks us to let him in or starts cursing. The professor pauses, as if gathering strength to continue. I've never heard such foul language. I don't know how much longer we can hold out here. Desperate fatigue is evident in the professor's eyes. We're like trapped in a tin can and subjected to mental attacks every time. The guys are starting to give up. His voice trembles with tension and fear. There were 10 of us here. Now there are 9. I pray that we manage to restore communication. The professor sighs, lowering his gaze. He looks utterly shattered by the hopelessness of the situation they find themselves in. Every day here becomes more and more of a trial for all of us, he concludes, and the video slowly fades out, leaving viewers in a state of concern and sympathy for Professor Jameson and his team, who find themselves in such a desperate and hopeless situation. In the next frame of the video, Professor Jameson sits alone in a room, his face filled with deep sadness. He begins to speak softly but heavily. Today, tragedy struck. We lost Michael. He was a good guy, always did his job excellently. His voice carries restrained pain. In the past few days, he looked worse than everyone else. We found his body hanging in his room. The professor pauses, as if trying to gather himself to continue. We can't bury him properly because we can't go outside. The storm hasn't subsided yet, and that creature is still standing at the door. The professor sighs, his gaze lost in emptiness. We took his body to the cellar, dug during the construction of the station. It's freezing there, and I hope the body won't start decomposing quickly. His voice sounds weary, and he seems physically and emotionally drained from the continuous tension of the past few days. Okay, I need to go, the professor concludes, slowly rising from his chair. He looks around once more, as if to make sure that no one and nothing is eavesdropping or spying on him, and the video cuts off. In the next frame of the video, Professor Jameson sits, holding his head in his hands, the image of extreme despair and confusion. He remains silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the floor. After a painful pause, he slowly begins to speak, his voice trembling with emotion. We found 3 bodies. I truly don't understand what's happening. All 3 bodies are torn apart, as if attacked by a predator. Confusion and fear fill his eyes. We can't figure out how it was done without anyone noticing, he continues, his voice growing increasingly desperate. The creature that was Nicholas is still outside and couldn't get inside. So it was someone among us. Or this creature is hiding somehow. Hopelessness resonates in his voice. I don't know what to do, the professor admits, his gaze lost and vacant. Everyone has stopped trusting each other. The atmosphere is extremely tense. His words reflect the deep crisis into which a series of horrifying events at the station has plunged his team. The scene changes again, and on the screen appears Professor Jameson, addressing the camera with a more resolute demeanor than ever before. 2 more have died, he begins, his voice firm and unequivocal. In the end, there are only 3 of us left. The professor pauses briefly, as if gathering strength for the next statement. I found that the sponge-like sample has disappeared. Someone must have been infected. Deep concern for the situation, spiraling out of control, is evident in his voice. I've decided to take extreme measures, he continues, and his determination is palpable in every word. I sedated the remaining 2 and restrained them until help arrives. I have no other choice. The professor sighs, emphasizing the weight of his decision and its consequences. Communication hasn't been restored yet, but I'm trying to figure it out on my own, the professor says, and his eyes show a determination to fight to the end, despite all the difficulties. If I fail, consider it all lost." With these words, the video ends. We stood in front of the laptop screen, enveloped in heavy silence, as the professor's final words faded away. We were all in deep shock, trying to grasp and make sense of the information we had just seen. Exchanging stunned glances, we sought support from each other, trying to find some meaning in what we had witnessed. The atmosphere was so tense that it seemed like the air around us froze in anticipation. Discussion of what had happened had only just begun when we were interrupted by our pilot, Mike. His voice, piercing and anxious, announced that a storm was brewing outside. Our hearts sank with fear. We realized that we would have to stay in this dreadful place until the storm subsided. "Lock the entrance door just in case," I told Mike, feeling the uncertainty in my own voice. After Mike left to carry out the order, I turned to the remaining members of our team with a new task: to search the base again. We needed to check every corner, especially the cellar mentioned by the professor. The words about the sponge-like sample disappearing echoed in my mind like a sentence. Someone had been infected. It changed everything. We split up to conduct the search more effectively, each step into the depths of the base feeling like a step into the unknown. With every door we opened, with every glance into the dark corners, our anxiety only grew. The realization that we might encounter something indescribable and dangerous, threatening not only our mission but our lives, hung over us like a heavy cloud. After thorough searches throughout the base, we finally discovered the cellar, which was cleverly hidden beneath the kitchen. This discovery was made entirely by accident when one of us noticed a bump on the floor, which upon closer inspection turned out to be a camouflaged door. With some difficulty, we managed to open it and descend into the darkness, where a grim sight awaited us. In the cellar lay the bodies of the deceased expedition members, neatly arranged along the walls. The freezing temperature in the cellar preserved them from decomposition, giving the place the eerie feeling of a cryochamber. But the real shock came when we discovered two bound individuals lying in the corner. They were the same two people mentioned by the professor in his notes, bound by him in an attempt to prevent the spread of infection. They were unconscious, but still alive. Our medic quickly diagnosed severe frostbite on them, which was not surprising considering that the cellar served not only as a food storage area, but also as an improvised morgue. We immediately transferred them to the infirmary, where we provided first aid, trying to restore circulation in their frostbitten limbs and stabilize their condition. We used all available means, including warm blankets and heat packs, to gradually warm their bodies. However, despite our efforts, they remained unconscious. Soon night fell, although here, in the depths of the Arctic night, it was always dark. The darkness beyond the station's windows seemed even denser and more impenetrable, as if nature itself emphasized the isolation and hopelessness of our situation. But sometime around midnight, the silence was broken by strange sounds. They resembled whispers, moans, sometimes turning into a kind of wailing, creating the sensation that something living, invisible, and agonizing surrounded us. These sounds filled us with horror, for the story told by Professor Jameson seemed to be repeating itself. The tension in the room became almost palpable. Every rustle made us flinch, and our imagination painted the darkest pictures. We sat huddled together, trying to find some comfort in each other's company, trying to convince ourselves that it was just the play of the wind or the strange acoustic effects of the Arctic desert. But deep down, each of us understood that what was happening around us could not be logically explained. Like shrouded in the shadow of horror, we spent the entire night in tension, trying to fall asleep, but anxiety and fear kept us awake. Every time our eyes began to close from fatigue, a new surge of strange sounds made us tense again, and sleep became impossible. This night seemed endless, every minute stretching agonizingly long. We waited for morning as some kind of salvation, although we understood that the dawn did not necessarily bring relief. The experience described by the professor reminded us that the threat does not disappear with the arrival of daylight, and sometimes it becomes even more tangible. The next day, the storm still raged with relentless force, as if an invisible beast fiercely attacked the walls of our temporary fortress. We tried to contact the base, but our attempts were unsuccessful due to unknown interference, which turned all signals into meaningless noise. Our radio operator said that we would have to try to establish communication after the storm subsided, when conditions might become more favorable for signal transmission. We continued to care for the sick who had not yet woken up. Their condition remained stable but silent, as if they were in some distant and unreachable place where we could not reach. The medic regularly checked their pulse and temperature, trying to do everything possible to sustain their lives until they finally opened their eyes and returned to us. Soon, as we sat in the hall, trying to distract ourselves from the horror looming over us, what we all expected but secretly hoped to avoid happened. Someone knocked on the doors. This knock sounded unexpectedly and at the same time relentlessly, cutting through the silence and making our hearts freeze with fear. We exchanged glances, a mixture of horror and anxiety evident in each one of us. None of us wanted to approach the door, for after all the stories of the professor and the events that had occurred, we could not be sure who or what awaited us on the other side. I stood up first. With a heavy feeling in my chest, I approached the door. There, through the frosty glass window in the door, I saw the familiar face of the professor. He looked normal, warmly dressed and standing, shivering at the door. When he saw me approaching, relief evident in his voice, he begged us to let him in, saying that he was freezing very badly. I didn't rush to open the door. My colleagues also approached to look at the professor. We quickly conferred and decided to wait and observe this person. Although we had no concrete evidence of his infection, we needed to ensure our safety before making a decision. A couple of hours passed. The professor was still standing by the door, and it was evident that he was starting to freeze even more. He pleaded with us to let him in, his words piercing us to the core. The constant wind intensified the feeling of cold, and it became apparent that he wouldn't survive outside much longer. We could no longer bear this sight. Gathering our strength and caution, we decided to open the door. The strong wind rushed inside like an unwelcome guest when we pushed the barrier aside. The professor, struggling against both the frost and the gusts of wind, slowly stepped inside. We quickly closed the door behind him, trying to isolate ourselves from the icy air outside. Everyone watched the professor attentively, trying to decipher whether it was indeed him who had returned to us, or if it was something else masquerading as a familiar figure. The tension in the air grew stronger as we tried to understand the consequences of his return. After we let him in and tried to warm him up, he looked around with hope in his voice and asked us if we were the rescuers. I replied affirmatively, to which he, tears in his eyes, threw himself at our feet, thanking us for saving him and expressing relief that he could finally leave this place. We escorted him to the kitchen and prepared a hot drink to help him recover from his ordeal. Then we asked him where he had been all this time. The professor told us his story. After he had bound those two people, the storm suddenly abated, and he found that the creature standing at the door had disappeared. Seizing the moment of calm, he decided to reconnoiter, going outside. He got on a snowmobile and circled the area, trying to understand if anything else had happened during the storm. As he was about to return, the professor saw that the creature had already transformed into a horrifying monster and burst out from under one of the modules, chasing after him. He had no choice but to step on the gas of the snowmobile and flee from this monster. Eventually, he managed to shake off the pursuit, but it was hard to find the way back. Soon, a new storm began, and he wandered in the darkness until, fortunately, he finally found the base. Otherwise, he would have died in the icy desert. Listening to the professor's tale of the horrors that were happening here left us deeply impressed. The incredible story of survival in the Arctic desert conditions and the encounter with something unknown left us with mixed feelings. Although we pretended to believe him, some distrust and fears still lingered. Deciding to err on the side of caution, we sent the professor to rest in one of the bedrooms, locking the door from the outside. We wanted to ensure safety before allowing him to move freely around the base. It seemed like everything had quieted down, and soon night fell. However, the strange sounds, reminiscent of whispers, moans, and cries, resumed, filling the cold corridors of the base with an unsettling anxiety. These sounds haunted us, creating an atmosphere of apprehension and anticipation of something unpredictable. The next day, I brought breakfast to the professor. Watching his behavior, I noticed nothing suspicious. He behaved perfectly normally, thanked us for our care, and seemed just like we knew him before all these events. After lengthy discussions and doubts, we decided to release him. We understood the risks, but also realized that we couldn't keep him locked up without substantial reasons. After that, the professor was able to move freely around the base. We still remained cautious, but his normal behavior gradually diminished our fears. The opportunity to observe him in normal circumstances allowed us to better understand his condition and ensure that there were no signs of infection or aggression. One day, during a conversation, I decided to ask the professor how he managed to restore communication and send an SOS signal, which ultimately led us to this base. To my surprise, he replied with astonishment in his voice. "I didn't send any signal." His answer puzzled us all. We exchanged glances, trying to understand what had really happened. Our radio operator, thoughtfully scratching his chin, put forward a suggestion. Perhaps the equipment malfunctioned for a moment and automatically sent out a distress signal. This explanation seemed quite logical, considering that many systems at the base were configured to react in emergencies in case of critical failures or other abnormal situations. We considered this version and came to the conclusion that in the conditions of extreme cold, storms, and other factors affecting the performance of equipment, brief power or communication restorations could indeed have occurred, sufficient to automatically send an SOS signal. While this explanation did not provide complete certainty about what was happening, it allowed us to form a working hypothesis about the reasons for our arrival. As we sat discussing the possible reasons for sending the SOS signal and our subsequent actions, a medic burst into the room with news that both patients in the infirmary had regained consciousness. We were simultaneously surprised and elated by this news, and hurried to the infirmary to see them with our own eyes. In the infirmary, both patients were indeed lying on beds, slightly propped up and eating porridge. When we entered, they looked at us with surprise but then continued eating. Their serious condition was evident to the naked eye, but the fact that they could sit up and eat again inspired hope. I approached closer and asked one of them what had happened. He reluctantly began to recall. His eyes filled with fear, and he clearly did not want to revisit those events in his memory. "Horrible things were happening at the station," he began, but suddenly stopped and raised frightened eyes somewhere behind me. Turning around, I noticed that the professor had entered the infirmary. At that moment, the other patient raised his hand and suddenly shouted, "It's him! He killed everyone! Beware!" His cry cut through the air, filling the room with tension and fear. All eyes instantly turned to the professor, who stood at the threshold with an unreadable expression on his face. As soon as the professor glanced at us, his gaze stopped on the patients, and he cast a malevolent look at them. Then strange convulsions began, which suddenly turned into a horrifying transformation. What we had seen on the video became a reality right before our eyes. The professor was turning into a werewolf. I reacted instantly, drawing my pistol from its holster, which I always carried. Quickly removing the safety, I opened fire on this creature. The creature roared and was thrown into the corridor by the shots. Without hesitation, I continued firing. But the creature managed to complete its transformation and, staggering, leaped aside, heading for the exit. At that moment, Mike came out of the door, unaware of what was happening. The creature simply shoved him out of the way, slamming him against the wall. I kept shooting, but it dodged the bullets. Reaching the exit, it pulled the handle, opened the door, and disappeared into the darkness of the Arctic night. With adrenaline coursing through me, I decided to chase after the terrifying creature. Stepping outside, I surveyed the area. Despite the night, everything around was relatively bright due to the reflection of moonlight off the snow. However, visibility was greatly reduced due to the storm. I walked along the residential module, peering into drifts and trying to track the creature. The strong wind created additional noise, making it difficult for me to determine where the sounds were coming from. Suddenly, I felt something moving behind me. I turned sharply, and at that moment the creature pounced on me. Instinctively, I reacted by firing my pistol. The bullet hit the creature directly in the eye, and its wounded body was thrown aside. I kept shooting, and then my comrades joined my pursuit, also opening fire. We kept shooting until the creature stopped moving. After we ceased fire, the medic approached me to make sure I was okay. Shining a flashlight on the body, to our surprise and shock, we saw that it had once again assumed the appearance of a human. This discovery struck us to the core. We stood, stunned, trying to understand how this could have happened and realizing that we had encountered something far beyond our understanding. Upon returning to the base, we carefully closed the door behind us, but we couldn't sleep all night. The events of the past few days had left a deep impression of fear and concern in our hearts. However, to our relief, the next day the storm finally subsided, giving us the opportunity to go outside. But we were in for a surprise. The body we had left on the snow had disappeared. This was the final straw. We realized that we needed to leave urgently. Hastily loading the patients onto the helicopter, we finally managed to fly away from this grim place. As we flew away from the base, I cast one last glance at it. Behind us remained the cold and darkness of the Arctic night, unresolved mysteries, and the echo of horror that seemed to linger in our memories for a long time.